welcome to Riverside. This is our fourth and final segment within the series of COVID-19 across Africa and its diaspora. I have been honored to bring you the series with two phenomenal women. Dr. Burchett, who is the moderator for today's segment, as well as Dr. Nkomi, who I think we are familiar with now. And so through these segments, we've been analyzing through different topics what the impact of COVID-19 was on those of African descent, and also getting through our wonderful panelists and through our very knowledgeable panelists through these segments, some takeaways as to, really as to how we were impacted, and also how we can, in the future, I guess fare better in the future as well. So today we are going to be discussing the survival and the vitality of the Black church. Riverside, if you are unfamiliar with Riverside, Riverside has a rich social justice history, and we give a number of different classes and other services as well. So please check out Riverside Church, its other offerings as well. To start today's segment, can the Reverend Van Hook, who's the Minister of Social Justice, can you please start us off with a prayer?
Yes, absolutely. I'd love to. Will you pray with me? Holy and eternal God, thou before whom angels bow, Lord, we come before you humbly today, and before we ask you for anything, we thank you for everything. Thank you for bringing each and every one of us together today, and thank you for the various leaders who have helped to put today's program in place. And Lord, we pray that we have a fruitful time together. Lord, we thank you for bringing us to this particular moment in history. As you know, that the past week has been a long and trying week. And Lord, we thank you for everything that you've done for us and the ways that you've shown up in our lives lately. Lord, please continue to guide us, protect us, direct us each and every day of our lives. And Lord, please bless this time together this afternoon. We pray this in the name of the one whose steadfast love endures forever. And all the people of God said together, amen.
Amen. Amen. Thank you, Reverend.
Thank you.
Okay. So our moderator for today is Dr. Burchett. Dr. Burchett she serves as the part-time assistant professor of writing and literature at New York City College of Technology in Brooklyn. She's also the author of Family Ties, Restoring Unity in the African American Family. And she's the development editor of a series of books for church-based Bible study, including Africans Who Shaped Our Faith, with Reverend Dr. Jeremiah Wright, and When Black Men Stand Up for God. There's a host of other accolades that Dr. Burchett brings, but for the interest of time, I will refer you to our church website that also contains the other many details of her bio as well. And so I'm going to bring forward Dr. Burchett, who's also going to introduce us to our panelists for today.
Okay, what I thought I would do is start out. Can you hear me? Am I muted? You cannot hear me.
We can hear you.
Okay.
We can hear you.
Okay, I thought what I would do is to start out with an image that has been embedded in our brains for the past week in order to give a little context to the content that we are discussing today. What I see right now after watching it all night, every night, is this screen, this interactive screen where MSNBC is tabulating the votes. And there's sort of like an energy coming from all of these little bubbles all over the place. There's energy, energy, energy coming from the bubbles. And history is being made, okay? And what I saw that is sort of like a macrocosm, a macro system, where we've got all this business, but there's order. There is some order involved in it. And what is so brilliant about it is that the order kind of like makes its way to the point of decision. All of a sudden, it's lots of bubbles, lots of activity, and then it comes to a point of decision. Well, those kinds of microsystems are busy interacting with macro systems all over the place right now. And that is the backdrop against which we are looking at the future of the African American community. But for today's session, we're looking at the Black church. We have several parallel systems going on. One being the pandemic. We've got the voter registration. We have a lot of racial violence and all of this. And we've been there before as a Black church. We have been in the midst of turmoil and disturbance. We have been in it in apartheid. We've been in it in slavery. We've been in it all the way back maybe to the founding of this country, and it will be there in the future. So the question that is on our plate today is, how is the Black church going to fare in this modern zone of the struggle? The pandemic, COVID-19 across Africa and throughout the diaspora. It's diaspora. And we want to look at it with a particular lens today against a particular backdrop. And we're looking at it from the standpoint of the question of some fundamental questions. One is the survival of the Black church, and as it survives, the vitality of the Black church, and what that says in terms of the contours of our theology. How will we explain all of this? Where do we go from here in those various domains? So what we have invited here is some of the top minds in the world. We have someone here who is really seasoned in the struggle of South Africa, who went through and is still in that struggle, and with Winnie Mandela and Nelson Mandela, and has written a phenomenal number of books and what have you. And he's here, Alan Bosek, Dr. Alan Bosek is here to look at, we're starting with Africa and moving out from Africa, okay, to its diaspora. And then we have, stopping along the way, we have the fabulous and most energetic Dr. Claudio Calvalles, who's going to reflect on South America and the Caribbean. And then we're moving over again to the United States, and we're inviting Dr. Andrea White, who has been mining theology in the struggle for a long time from a womanist perspective, but also from other perspectives. So what we would like to do is to hear from them as to the Black church in this particular struggle. So to begin, I would like to start with Africa. And I'm going to share screen because I'd like to read his biography. Just 1 minute. Now, let's see, we had a little confusion here. All right, maybe here's where we go. What we have here. It's just a bit of, a little bit. Oh, here we are. All right. And let's share the screen. Okay. Since we're beginning with Africa, minimize this. We'll deal with Dr. Alan Bosek first. And maybe we might need to reduce the size here a bit so we can see this. Pleasant, just, Okay, and let's move this actually. Okay. Alan Aubrey Bosek is a South African minister in the South African Dutch Reformed Church. He has been an outstanding anti-apartheid activist working alongside Byers Naude and Winnie Mandela. He won the 1985 Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights Award. It is given annual by the Robert F. Kennedy Center for Justice and Human Rights to an individual or group for courageous activism in the spirit of Robert Kennedy. Among his publications are his doctoral dissertation, Farewell to Innocence, a socio-ethical study of Black theology and Black power. Also, the Radical Reconciliation Beyond Political Pietism and Christian Pietism. And then he's also written Dare We Speak of Hope, Searching for a Language of Life in Faith and Politics. And also Kairos Crisis and Global Apartheid, The Challenge to Prophetic Witness. Okay. And what we would like to hear from him is, first of all, how he would address this topic. And then we want to have some follow-up questions. What I'd like to ask you to do, if you will, is to write questions in the chat. But as you write the questions, would you please, sure, I'm still here. Hold on, what happened? Screen sharing is paused. Okay, stop share. All right, stop share. I've got you back. Okay, what we would like to do is, as he's addressing the concerns that we've raised, I'd like to invite you to enter questions, any questions you have in the chat. But would you first identify yourself, of course, and then would you put that this Africa, okay, Africa for that one. And as we move to other panelists, the title of the questions would be different and you would have a different area of the world. So first of all, I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Alan Bosek, and he'll have up to 15 minutes in order to address the question, and then you can type some of your questions and we'll be able to get back to him when we have the Q&A session. Okay? All right, thank you. Dr. Bosek, it's yours.
Thank you very much. Good evening, everybody. Good day. It's a great pleasure to be with you and participate in your discussion on the question COVID and the survival and vitality of the Black Church. And I will do that in 13 short theses. Number one, we live in a moment in history that presents us with the conflation of at least three calamitous manifestations. There are more, but I mentioned three. A climate catastrophe, which has brought us face to face with the total destruction of the earth and the extinction of life as we know it. The devastation of the rainforest, the burning Amazon, the desertification of sub-Saharan Africa, floods, hurricanes, and heat waves are the evidence of humankind's greed and hubris trying to undo what God has created. B, today, in far too many cases, national politics is dominated by narrow, ethnic, sometimes Christian nationalisms, racism, white supremacy, authoritarianism, legitimized bigotry, and religious zealotry. Globally, we are not faring any better. Foreign policies are characterized by bullying and forceful capitulation and forced submission of weakened nations through blackmail, reckless lawlessness instead of international law, rabid ethnic and religious nationalism instead of inclusive global security, and xenophobic rage instead of an understanding of our common humanity. Imperialist expansionism instead of peaceful coexistence, and unbridled, destructive, neoliberal, capitalist exploitation instead of planetary security. It is a form of international political vandalism. C, President Trump, who seems to have regarded himself as the chosen leader and model of all this, has been presiding, however, over a decaying empire. And it is likely that under Mr. Biden, the decline of the American empire will continue. And just as with all decaying empires facing their own destruction, it presents the world with even greater dangers, both to the world and to its own people. Second thesis. On top of all these comes the coronavirus, ushering in new crises of fear, uncertainty, and the devastation not often seen before, even though the horrors of hunger, war, displacement, and the deaths in the hundreds of thousands have become commonplace in many countries of the global south. In a country like Yemen, for instance, the pandemic only really means that they are now even lower on the international community scale of priorities. Over against all of this, it seems to me, is the one force that I see as a source of hope: the global revolution against injustice, imperialist violence and greed, and for life, global solidarity, and human dignity. And I see that captured in the Black Lives Matter movement. The question, therefore, is not simply about the survival and the vitality of the Black church in a crisis, but the whole complex of crises upon us today. But it is also a response to the forces for good, whose wonderful resilience is both a great comfort, a call to action, and an invitation to reaffirm life. Number three, the coronavirus has itself destroyed the myth that the pandemic is the so-called great equalizer. It has not only exposed the criminal inequalities in healthcare, it has exposed all the entrenched structural, institutional, and systemic economic, social, and political inequalities, and the incessant comprehensive war against the poor and the vulnerable globally and nationally. Whether we are talking about people of color in Africa, the US, the UK, or Europe, or Native Americans in the US, Canada, Bolivia, Brazil, or Chile, the racial element in all this nationally and globally is now undeniable. Experts warn that poverty, hunger, diseases, and violence exacerbated by the pandemic, including gender-based violence, may dwarf the number of those dying in the virus itself. United Nations General Secretary Antonio Guterres made a powerful point just the other day. I quote him: "The world," he says, "is at a breaking point. This pandemic has been likened to an X-ray, revealing fractures in the fragile skeleton of the societies we have built. It is exposing fallacies and falsehoods everywhere. The lie that free markets can deliver healthcare for all, the fiction that unpaid care work is not work, the delusion that we live in a post-racist world, the myth that we are all in the same boat. Because while we are all floating on the same sea, it is clear that some are in super yachts while others are clinging to the floating debris," end quote. And all this flies in the face of the calls for global solidarity the World Health Organization pleads for every day. Oxfam calls it a care crisis. The WHO calls it a moral and political crisis. The American Psychiatric Association now speaks of a psychological crisis, referring to the spike in mental illnesses as a result of the virus. 30 years ago, German theologian Jürgen Moltmann spoke of a God crisis. It seems now more relevant than ever. Thesis number 4. The poor are facing intensifying calamities at every level, from criminal neglect by governments to joblessness to evictions, from overwhelming and unpayable debt to illness and death in vastly disproportionate numbers, to say nothing of spiritual despair. They are drowning in a river of escalating impoverishment, while the rich are not only getting richer, but are profiting shamelessly from the virus itself. Jeff Bezos' $30 billion profit in one day just a few weeks ago is staggering, but really only a drop in the ocean of wealth collection and expansion during these times. Meanwhile, by the end of this year, 12,000 people will die of hunger every day, most of them in the global south and in the third world of the empire. In South Africa, endemic corruption allows shameless looting of funds designated for the poor and vulnerable by ruthless politicians, officials, and the capitalist entrepreneuring class. Thesis number 5. In the search for a vaccine, we hope will stem the tide and even turn the forward rush of the virus, the rich have already secured their own safety. The United States has cornered the market for the vaccine by securing contracts worth almost $7 billion with 4 pharmaceutical companies for 400 million doses of these vaccines. Other rich countries like the UK are doing the same. Poor countries like African countries are not only way down the line, they are completely out of sight. Never before has global apartheid been so glaring. All the subtlety and obfuscation is now gone. Number 6. But still, besides all this, is what Aimé Césaire of Martinique has called the singularity of Blackness. Césaire speaks of the singularity of our situation in the world, which cannot be confused with any other. The singularity of our problems, which cannot be reduced to any other problem. The singularity of our history, constructed out of terrible misfortunes that belong to no one else. The singularity of our culture, which we wish to live in a way that is more and more real, end quote. Césaire is right, of course. Our history of slavery and subjection to imperialism, of genocide, oppression, and exploitation, of apartheid and Jim Crow, all speaks to the truth of that, and all of it predicated on our Blackness. Thesis 7. Apart from the blatant discriminations Black people face every day, there are the more subtle realities hidden among the already frightening statistics revealing everyday life. So when we read of things about Americans of the bottom half, and even within that category of the lowest 20% of their earnings scale, they are really talking about African Americans. When they express confidence in the American economy despite COVID because the stock markets are doing great, what they do not mention is that nearly half of American households own no stock at all. And what that means is that for Hispanics, that represents 69% of households, for African Americans, 72% of households. When they brag about their PPP loans, they must not fail to mention that not only did the vast majority of funds go to big white-controlled corporations, but also that only 2% went to Black businesses. Thesis number 8. In South Africa, the socio-economic inequalities have made South Africa now the most unequal society on earth. Our ruling party has, with unseemly haste, embraced the old apartheid new liberal capitalist policies, made common cause with the old white capitalist class, created a new Black capitalist aristocracy, so that the gap between rich and poor is now wider than even in the days of apartheid. Corruption has become endemic. Our politics has turned into a power-hungry kleptocratic monster. State funds stolen from the poor will amount to 500 billion rand in the next 2 years. And even during the pandemic, the rich still continue to rob the poor on a scale that I find breathtaking. So when our president, a multi-billionaire himself, speaks of the challenges to our people, is he really talking about the Black poorest of the poor, or is he speaking of the rich elites, the political and economic aristocracy of the country of which he is one? There are, said Henry Highland Garnet, African-American Presbyterian minister in 1843, pharaohs on both sides of the blood-red waters. Number 9, we should not even begin to talk about the lynchings throughout a murderous century now revived in state-sponsored terrorism in the United States, invited, instigated, and actively embraced by an unapologetic, unashamed white supremacy, hiding behind a police badge and the power and status of the highest office in the land. Every Black death in the streets of America is a stake through our own African heart. Without doubt, the singularity of Blackness is stark, painful, and vicious reality. And the question about the survival of the Black church and pinning our hopes on the vitality of the Black church goes to the heart of the matter. Number 10. But here is the amazing thing, though. The phrase, the singularity of Blackness, embraces both the singularity of our historical pain, the particularity of our vitality, and the uniqueness of our survival. And it is right and proper that you have put all this in the title of our discussion. So if the question is raised, how shall the Black church survive these times of crisis? The answer must immediately be by turning to the sources of our vitality. There's a reason why the Black church in both our countries has historically been places of refuge, sustenance, and inspiration towards resistance. Of course, it must always begin with a reaffirmation. If it had not been for the Lord, and also we've come thus far by faith, leaning on the Lord. And it is true, God has never failed us yet. More than a century ago, South Africa's Sol Plaatje put it this way, I quote, "The one thing that stands between us and despair is that heaven has not yet deserted us." Number 11, we have survived and resisted 400 years and more of slavery, imperialism, colonialism, white supremacist but patriarchal, homophobic, capitalistic tyranny. For centuries, the Bible was used as a battering ram of white racist superiority and domination, an infallible source not of the glory and justice of a holy God, but of Black inferiority and subjection. Yet, Black Christians did not throw the Bible into the heart of the sea. We instead wrested it from the hands of the Pharaoh, and with that also their power to read and interpret it for us, and found in its most authentic, enduring message that God is the God of the poor and the oppressed, the liberator of the captives, the healer of the brokenhearted, defender of the widow and the orphan. This is the faith that made us not just survive, but rise up against oppression and produced our prophets, Sojourner Truth and Phyllis Wheatley, Denmark Vesey and Henry McNeil Turner, Ella Baker and Martin Luther King Jr., Adelaide Tambo and Sophia De Bruyn, Albert Luthuli and Robert Sobukwe, Winnie Mandela and Steve Biko. That prophetic tradition is a well of vitality from which the Black church must drink. Number 12, we must reclaim the ability and the necessity to speak truth to ourselves so that we are able to speak truth to power. So we must ask the hard questions of the Black church. Are we still that prophetic church that offered guidance, sustenance, and hope to our people in times of struggle and in our struggles for freedom? Is our theology still one of liberation towards the wholeness of humanity? Or have we become the enablers, the aiders, and abettors of the re-enslavement of our people to the ideologies of neoliberal consumerist capitalism, baptized bigotry, and sanctified imperialism? I have indicated that one of the greatest signs of hope in the midst of these crises is the global revolution for freedom, dignity, and life led by the Black Lives Matter movement. Can we discern God at work in that revolution, where it moves towards greater human solidarity, greater justice, greater inclusion, and the creation of a new humanity? Can the Black church join that revolution, not as a Christianizing, pacifying agent, but as a sacrificial partisan of justice? Finally, we must reclaim anew for ourselves that stubborn, very first confession of the Christian church, the Lordship of Jesus Christ. The Lordship that is supreme servanthood and that inspires us to sacrificial deeds of love and justice and gives us courage beyond human imagination. It is a belief that countless Black South Africans, myself included, took with us into the streets of protest and confrontation, into the prison cells and torture chambers, into the face of death. Jesus is Lord. So no matter what happens, Jesus is Lord. Come mockery and revilement and disdain and shame, come threat and intimidation, come death, come imprisonment and torture. This is true. Jesus is Lord. In that confession is all the truth that makes us free, all the wisdom to keep us humble, all the faith to know the way, all the hope to give us courage, all the strength to make us love, all the joy to keep us human. And that for me is both the survival and the vitality of the Black church. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we so appreciate that. I would like to ask people, if you will, to at this moment take a pause, and would you type in any questions that you would like Dr. Bosek to answer in the question and answer session? And would you label them his name and Africa, so that we'll get them all together? And if you have other questions that come up when some of the other presenters are presenting, you can also enter them, but label them so that we can group them together during the question and answer period. Okay, we would like then to move to Dr. Claudio Cavalles, and we'd like you to address some of the same questions as they apply to the Latin American Caribbean context, and any other observations that you have on the United States in its context, as Dr. Bosek did.
All right. So first, thank you so much for inviting me to be with you, my sisters. Thank you so much for doing this, which is a powerful, powerful series of encounters that are blessing so many people. I have to say that I'm so grateful to see Dr. Burchett, because I remember our time at Union when we were at the computer room, and Dr. Burchett was always there feverishly preparing classes and classes and classes. So she is an educator par excellence. And I've seen the hours that she spent there. So just to be in the same room with Dr. Burchett is such a blessing. Thank you. So I think we all come with a lighter heart today, right? That election kinds of uplifts, takes away from our body. I feel it's a joy in our body that we feel. It's just like a lighter sense to go into the world, and I think that is perceived in so many communities. And it's good that finally we're going to have a group of doctors who will take care of this COVID crisis. So let me say something about COVID, and then the situation in Latin America, and then talk about the churches. So there's three points. The way we understand COVID is fundamental for us to understand the underpinnings of everything else. And Professor Bosek has already given us so much in that correlation of the virus and our lives in this geopolitical structure of our times, and the specific points of the Black Church. So much we have already received. But I want us to think about this deadly, the COVID as a deadly virus that is ourselves, and also a metaphor of ourselves. More than anything, the virus is a call to an awareness of who we are and the ways we live and understand life. And I believe we are in complete dissonance with the earth, and the COVID is showing it so blatantly to us, and to see how we are so disconnected from the earth. And as long as we continue this way, this virus will go from a pandemic to endemic, but other monsters and viruses will visit us and will continue to come. As the French thinker Bruno Latour says, this can be only a rehearsal of our future, of our common life. And so I think for us to understand the virus is a call also to understand our cosmologies, right? If we take indigenous and Yoruba traditions, we see in Brazil, the shaman Yanomami, Davi Kopenawa, says that all of the non-indigenous people feel like they are the people of the merchandise. That's how they call us all. Black, whites, browns, reds, yellow, but the reds, right? He says that we love things too much, that's all that we look for, that all that we know how to understand ourselves from and through. And that means that there's no correlation between the earth, our common ways of living, and the limits, the fundamental limits that the earth places on us. Schopenhauer said that because of that this juncture, the detachment from the earth, we destroy the earth, and with it we are killing also the spirits, what in the Yanomami cosmology is called the Shapiris, who are the spirits that keep the balance on earth and keep the sky from falling on our heads. So there's an enormous correlation between how we relate to ourselves and the beginning and the end, also in relation to the earth. In the Yoruba tradition, we learn about Omolu, which is an Orisha who is responsible for diseases and for cures at individual and collective level. For the Yoruba cosmology, the pandemics are expressions of imbalances in our relationship with one another and nature, which includes fauna, flora, animals, people, and the spirits. So the Orisha Omolu, as a force of nature that governs these imbalances, demands us into a collective change. And that's the only way, that's a requirement for us to find healing in this time. So if we perceive these two cosmologies, we can see a complex networking of spirits, nature, and human presences, each one with its own forms of agencies. And these relations, when lived in symbiotic connections, can keep the balance of the world we live in. However, we are the results of 500 years of massive destruction, right? Where the cosmology of white settlers and coloniality have drastically changed this balance. The ethnocentric domination of the colonizers, which includes also Christianity, divides us and placed us in hierarchies of race, class, and nature, all distinguished from each other. No wonder we have the classic battle between, the Itwa, the liberation theologian that Professor Bozek knows really well, how we have culture from Africa, race from US, and class from Latin America. And we were all fighting each other, saying, you don't have that enough in your theology, which was all true. But we kept them separately in many instances. So that ethnocentric domination of the colonized divided us into those structures, and we went into it. And so we have also engaged into these distinctions and hierarchies with our own Christian sense of transcendence and immanence. So we tend to affirm somebody and deny another. We tend to deny our multiplicities of deep relationalities. So capitalism has taught us that we are to live on our own. And we are a thing in itself, independent of each other. And this is so successful here in the United States, right? Because we are all on our own. If I myself did something good because I worked hard. If I haven't succeeded, I myself must have some problem. It is never an understanding of a collective, of a gathering. So we are placed in distinct silos, and we are supposed to leave from there. So as an individual selves trying to get back into a whole, we don't know what this whole quite means. So the empire adage, conquer and divide, has reached its maximum operational results. So the COVID pandemic tells us about the ways we have learned how to see life, and how white supremacy has instilled in us a division that seems natural. And the fight to live seems to be an Herculean task every day. The capitalist supremacy owns our religions, our beliefs, our ethics, our aesthetics, our politics, and our detached ways of living, so much often away from nature. So under the control of the state, we are shattered pieces of a broken mirror that cannot show us who we are collectively anymore. Instead, the broken mirror of 1,000 pieces are only re-articulated by white supremacy, patriarchy, and the market within the structures of our own lives, only to show back to us a dystopic notion of who we are, telling us that we are alone, away from the earth, from the sources of our wisdom, strength, and ancestors. So I think we are all under that most large captive way of control, which is just another way, I think, of saying what Professor Bozek had already gave to us in so much more and more elegant and deep and powerful ways. So when we think about the Caribbean and Latin America, I wonder how much divided we are that we don't see that our histories are all interconnected. The histories of joys and sorrows are all interconnected. And the same thing that we see here, we see there. And so it's not a surprise that the same minorities that are the poor ones are the ones suffering here, are the ones suffering there too. Surely this pandemic doesn't see boundaries, some class or race boundaries, but you know, some people have care, health treatment, access to health systems. And so that marks the injustices everywhere. So in the Caribbean and Latin America, in order to understand the situation and the Black church, you have to understand there's a difference between race and race and how we see race in there. The way we see race in the United States, the black and white divide, doesn't quite work well in those regions because of the mixture of all kinds of blacks and Europeans and indigenous communities that have created a different miscegenation and mixtures and cruises of political and social entanglements. In all of these countries, blacks and indigenous are actually the majority, and yet they are at the bottom of their own society. So in Latin America, I could say that all poor are black, and almost all whites are also poor, and almost all blacks and browns and blacks are all, and all the whites and almost whites are also blacks. So, however, blacks and indigenous people are in different grid of blackness, of the blackness. Is a different thing because in some ways, the indigenous people haven't been turned into poor yet. So it's a different kind of control. So when we talk about COVID and the Black church, we are talking about a church of a colored church, of churches of many colors. But for all of them, there's no government care, and they are on their own. And it's hard to find health care, and the limitations are exponential. So in those regions, we could say this in a nutshell: poverty meets an absent state, that meets unemployment, that meets lack of resources, that meets corruption, that meets indifferences of all kinds, that meets violence, that meets vulnerability, that meets coloniality. So if you, in the next few years, and by the end of this year, actually, 231 million people in Latin America are predicted to be living in poverty, which is a level that was seen only 15 years ago. Latin American countries have long had some of the worst scaring and scarring income inequalities in the world, and they are predicted to get worsened. The informal labor market is huge, making up 54% of all work across the region, up to 70% in some countries, such as Peru. Informal workers have little access to social protection and have no choice but to continue work daily to earn a living. The result is that their capability to follow quarantine and social distancing measures is limited. Informal workers also have less access to health care. The other day, I read something that just broke my heart. There was this group of Black women offering to work just for food. Just for food. So in the situation, when we look at the place and the role of churches, it is the only place that you can find a voice and a sense that you are somebody. So in that way, which is powerful in the Black church here, right? That you go there and throughout the week you hear you're nobody. You go to church and you hear you are somebody. That's the same thing that happens there too. And so all the churches who are all Blacks and brown people, and brown there doesn't mean Latinos, but a different color of the skin, live in the outskirts of the big city. So it's opposite here. What is the suburban United States? Is actually the abandoned downtown there. So the suburbs of this community is far away from where the rich live, is where all the abandoned people are. And it is in those places that they can barely exist, but that's where they have to find a way to survive. And without support of the government, those are places where the state doesn't go and is more and more moving away from it, creating a complex alternate forms of power, one of which now in Rio de Janeiro is called the militias, who are taking over the power of the police and the government and create their own rules. And now you have to pay extra to walk in the communities, or to have a business, or to have a church or something. So it is within this background that we see the pandemics coming. And so the responses of churches have been two kinds. One are most of the big churches who are in favor of like, let's get Brazil and Bolsonaro, which is the same thing of Trump here. A lot of the big leaders of the big churches are with Bolsonaro, and so they are deniers of this of the COVID. And so what they do is to push for the churches to gather and to keep having their worship services. And so those mega churches are losing some of the not of the big congregations, but the small congregations in the suburban areas. They are losing because they cannot keep the tithes and the offerings, so they are closing down. So the bigger church, the mother church, are strategically finding the local congregation that can still give money and keep those congregations going, but all the others, they are closing. So this is one of the responses from the Black and colored and white churches in Latin America, and indigenous churches in Latin America. The other one is the one that is more fascinating, which are small churches, independent churches. And because they do not have much expenses, they didn't have to buy this enormous space to have their own worship places, because they started in somebody's garage or living room or house, so they do not have much to spend on. So those communities continue, and it is within those communities that you find ways to survive COVID. It is in those places that you engage each other, that you find your food, that you find resources, that you find a way of feeling protected, that you find ways of being seen. So with the total absence of the government, so you find this place where you actually exist. So the church has not only replaced in some ways the presence of the state, but they have actually to fight against the state, who see those places as places of excess, of places where these people should die, because then they're not going to be a burden to the state and to the common resources. So the death of these people is actually necropolitics in action, without the government having to establish rules. It is a natural extinction by way of biopower and necropolitics. But it is there, clinging to each other, that this church and the Black churches there are actually responding and are surviving. And this is the most beautiful way of seeing how these communities, in all their weaknesses, in all their frailties, they are still being the only place that are sustaining people's collectivities, people's lives, people's spirit, and are keeping them alive. So I think I will stop here. I'll have some other things, but I think I'll stop here so that we can have more conversation. So thank you.
Okay. All right, then what I would like to do is to, let's see if I can get this sheet up again. Okay, I would like to then move to Dr. Andrea White. And I wanted to do an introduction. Let's see. Okay, I should go back. Actually, I'll try to make up for that later. I didn't get a chance to introduce Dr. Okay, let's see. Okay, share, that's what I need to do. I'm figuring out the technology while I'm, okay, let's see how we do this here. Wait a minute. Oh, here we go, maybe here. Okay. Just before I go to, let's see if I need to stop this. I just want to pause for a minute because I did not introduce Dr. Caballes.
Oh, no need. We got no need. Just move on to the most amazing Professor White.
Well,
fine.
we'll get back to that sooner as we move forward in time here.
No need.
No need to introduce me, Colleen.
Okay,
Really.
all right. You want to go ahead and we'll. Okay, then let me stop share. Okay, we want to pose the same questions to you from the standpoint, from the perspective of the United States. And would you like to address the impact of COVID, and the resilience and survival of the Black church, and what that means in terms of the contours of our theology?
Thank you, Reverend Dr. Burchett, and thank you for having me. I want to thank the entire African Fellowship for this amazing series, and I can't believe we're here at the grand finale, 4 weeks of this great series. It's just really an honor to be here. I also have to thank the Riverside Church for its support of this series. We're really grateful that we've been able to come together and have this conversation, and grateful for the support. And I am the organizers. The organizers just did an amazing job of getting all these brilliant panelists together. Definitely. And finally, to my fellow panelists, what an enormous honor to be with Dr. Bozak and Dr. Carvalles. I really don't belong here, but it's really, really, truly an honor to be with you. I'm going to, I think it's appropriate to begin my remarks today with giving voice to another Black woman. So I'm hoping the technology will cooperate. I'm going to share my screen, and I'm going to start with the words of our Pulitzer Prize-winning poet and poet laureate of the United States, Tracy K. Smith. And this will be a jumping off point for my comments on our theme for this afternoon. So hopefully this will all work out as planned.
Water, and it is
Can you hear?
dedicated to the
Yes.
Geechee ring shouters. One of the women greeted me. "I love you," she said. She didn't know me, but I believed her, and a terrible new ache rolled over in my chest, like in a room where the drapes have been swept back. "I love you. I love you," as she continued down the hall past other strangers, each feeling pierced suddenly by pillars of heavy light. "I love you" throughout the performance, and every hand clap, every stomp. "I love you" in the rusted iron chains someone was made to drag, until love let them be unclasped and left empty in the center of the ring. "I love you" in the water, where they pretended to wade, singing that old blood-deep song that dragged us to those banks and cast us in. "I love you," the angles of it scraping at each throat, shouldering past the swirling dust motes and those beams of light that whatever we now knew we could let ourselves feel knew to climb. Oh, woods. Oh, dogs. Oh, tree. Oh, gun. Oh, girl, run. Oh, miraculous many gone. Oh, Lord. Oh, Lord. Oh, Lord. Is this love the trouble you promised?
Okay, give me just a moment. Thanks. Well, I wanted to start there because of the incredibly profound words of this poem, but especially because of the last line. O Lord, is this love the trouble you promised? Many of you know that I am a professor of womanist theology, and Alice Walker is often credited for coining the term womanism, and some very important womanist scholars here at Union Theological Seminary, where I teach, decided to come up with an understanding of the matters of race and gender as theological problems for attending to Black women's experience. So womanism is a study of women of color and the notion of race and gender as theological problems. And it comes straight from Alice Walker, another woman of letters, Black feminist. And there's something in Tracy K. Smith's poem that strikes me and reminds me of what Alice Walker has said about a womanist. A womanist is a woman who loves struggle. So like Tracy K. Smith, there's some intuition that God's love is somehow a promise of trouble, and a Black woman is a woman who loves struggle. I find this a provocative invitation to consider as we think about the Black church's relationship to struggle and to COVID in particular. Last time I was with you, I suggested that God is an angry Black woman. And I talked about all of the ways in which the angry Black woman motif was used to do harm and reduce the humanity of Kamala Harris. And I decided to reappropriate the angry Black woman motif and use it actually unapologetically, and to think about God as an angry Black woman. I talked about James Cone. This is basically where we left off last time I was with you, and we spoke about the gendered effects of COVID. James Cone, the father of Black liberation theology, has proposed that divine love requires divine wrath. Divine love requires divine wrath in response to injustice. And while we agree that love is indispensable to the concept of God, there's little agreement about how love is reconciled with wrath. We've got law and gospel, Old Testament and New, and divine wrath and love appear as warring gods in a polytheistic religious account. Retribution, reward, punishment on the one hand, grace, mercy, and redemption on the other. Divine love is not only the dominant motif in our Christian story, it subdues any notion of divine wrath that is almost entirely fallen out of view. So James Cone's concern is that this approach not only fails to take seriously the concept of God's righteousness, it reduces divine love to mere sentimentality. Cone is interested to convey divine wrath as an expression of divine love because divine love is a matter of justice. Divine love in the form of justice is more than an ethical or social critique of human sin. It's a theological claim about who God is. Divine love reveals how the unloved and the despised are caught up in God's work of redemption and ultimately in divine desire. I suggested that what we need are sacraments of resistance, rituals of participation with a God who sees our destruction of the earth, and an angry Black woman who is more than a little pissed off. Today, in the United States, there is singing and dancing in the streets. And in the United States, over 70 million people voted for Black death. In the United States, we elected a Black woman to the executive branch of government. And in the United States, American flags are waving in the name of white nationalism. On this day, if only for a fleeting moment, the Black church may breathe, but this breath is a shallow breath as we bury our dead. What word can possibly be spoken to the Black church in its virtual gathering spaces? At a time when every single parishioner requires an urgent pastoral care visit, and Black church leaders are called to the public square and to the streets, the offering plate is not making its way through cyberspace, and the church is struggling to stay alive when we need it the most. Our very existence has always been fraught, but we have risen up in the hush harbors. If I had to choose the two words I've heard more than any others in the past 8 months of our pandemic, I would choose unprecedented and resilient. Haven't you heard those words over and over and over again? I find them both quietly disturbing, not because of their relentless repetition, but because of their symbolic function. There's no doubt that there is something idiosyncratic to our shared global experience of the pandemic, but the refrain that the experience is unprecedented feeds the virus of denial, resignation, and refusal of concession that is ever so familiar to Black life. Did you hear what I said? Refusal of concession. Ever so familiar to Black life. It's the everyday ordinariness that makes it invisible. The death of George Floyd is, of course, a violent act, but its tragedy lies in its commonality, its everydayness. As a nation, we have had our hands in our pockets. His death is the natural outcome of a national culture that would campaign for a second term of white nationalism. Black death and the election of white supremacy belong to the same logic. And like COVID-19, Black death is insidious, unpalatable, and invisible. Last night, Kimberly Crenshaw, founder and executive director of the African American Policy Forum, some of you know her as coining the term intersectionality, she issued this statement. She wrote, "Today we celebrate, congratulate, and appreciate. Tomorrow we must fight, not against division, but white supremacy, not against patriotism, but fascism, not against difference, but dominance. We can never make peace with any of Trumpism, nor abandon those harmed by it. Healing requires disinfecting the wound, not ignoring it, and holding those accountable for inflicting it. This emerging let bygones be bygones is why Black folks who saved the United States the first time it broke, lived in hell for a century afterward. It can't happen again." The one who may be named, she actually says her name, but I'm going to call him the one who may not be named, was a historically popular and effective Republican candidate, not in spite of his white supremacist tactics. Instead, he received 70 million votes and counting, precisely because he so effectively mined this nation's history, a history steeped in genocide, slavery, apartheid, and patriarchy. As many Americans begin to treat his administration as a horrifying aberration, we must mobilize with a recognition that he was no outlier. He was the logical extension of a vicious social history. That was all in her statement. Kimberly Crenshaw describes COVID as being under the black light, literally a light shining on Blackness, on the cultural, political, social, and economic contours of Blackness in the United States. The virus hasn't created these conditions, but it illuminates and lays bare the social death and lethal effects on persons of color, and as I argued last time, especially women of color. These effects that have been with us all along, a normalization of violence, the violence that loves to hide. The virus reveals not the unprecedented, but our comfort level with certain deaths that lives very much at the root of who we are as a nation. Dr. Carvallis spoke so effectively to this point of COVID's revelatory effects of who we are. The virus simply amplifies and exacerbates the normalization of violence in our politics, in our theologies, and even in our pulpits. As for that second term, resilience, while we may want to celebrate our expressions of resilience in the face of despair, we may not realize this repeated refrain has a different ring, especially in the ears of Black women. The trope of the strong Black woman helps me make my point. I had a student point out to me this week that Michelle Obama had a podcast recently where she had an interview with Michelle Norris. She pointed out that the trope of the strong Black woman is a cement necklace. Michelle Obama agreed, and Michelle Norris continued on saying, you know, that's supposed to feel like pearls. It's supposed to be a compliment. But what it is it perpetuates the notion that we can throw anything at you. We can just hurl anything at Black women, and they will catch it and look elegant doing it. So in the beaming sunshine today, as we dance to Mary J. Blige, as we dance with Kamala Harris, and as we bless our ancestors, let us be careful not to send another Black woman out into the plantation field and congratulate her for being a strong Black woman while we force her to nurse us back into health. Let us resist the urge to make her our mammy, an essential worker we applaud, but to whom we deny sufficient pay and whose body is sacrificed for our benefit. Let us celebrate this moment of triumph, but may we remember that our hope is in God, not in nation. The Black church must resist the urge to confuse historical national triumph with divine favor, for that is merely yet another prosperity gospel. We must not conflate divine sovereignty with dominance, divine power with a masculinist Ubermensch who can beat COVID and lives to tell the tale. May we heed the call to love struggle as an expression of hope, not because we believe in redemptive suffering, but because our hope is an act of resistance. May our politics of hope not be rhetorical flourish, but an ethical critique of the status quo. May we remember to read the present with the fierce urgency of now, and may the Black church remember the God who met Hagar in the wilderness and ordained survival not as mere life, but as more life. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Oh, that was awesome, all of you. We do have a set of questions, and I'm going to try to handle this in an orderly manner. We have 10 questions. Let's see if we can get back up to the top here and direct them to, let's see here. Okay, this is from Joyce Kwakshi. I hope I'm pronouncing your last name correctly, Joyce. I always mess it up. Okay, how can we use our natural resources as a leverage to improve the African situation? And I'm supposing that will go to Africa, but if anyone wants, any of the panelists want to address it, feel free. It says to everyone.
Okay, I guess since I'm from Africa, I should respond to that first. I mean, if the difficulty is not that Africa does not have enough resources naturally to lift all her people out of poverty, or that she does not have enough land to provide food for all her people. But we have, since the days of the ending of formal colonialism, really not used the potential of Africa as Africa and of all her people in the way that we should have. And we have had, apart from a few very strong leaders, a series of very disappointing leaders in Africa. And you can say, I just want to say two quick things because I can't stay too long. I thought that we would be until 10 o'clock and then I made an appointment for something else afterwards. But let me say, look at the Congo. It's not all just Africa's fault because look at the Congo. The problem with the Congo and the fact that there is this incessant civil war that never seems to end in the Congo is probably the Congo is simply too rich. She has too much, and it's too much of a temptation for too many actors from outside, especially the Western world. I mean, I have been in the Congo and I have seen how private planes land with privateers from New York and Tel Aviv to come and pick up diamonds gathered by warlords in exchange for money and guns. Out of reach in the northeastern provinces, out of reach of the government. And so as long as Congo is unstable, those profiteers can do whatever they like. And that's part of the problem. But we have suffered from colonialism from the West, imperialism from the West. And what we are doing now is Africa's leaders are selling us out once again to China. So China is the coming imperialist power. And what do we see? China comes and China helps with infrastructure, China helps with buildings, China helps with this and that. But what does China want? She's not as aggressive and abrasive as America, for instance. But China comes quietly, and China wants mineral rights, and China wants land. And so we take Africa out of the enslavement of one enslaver, and we put her into the hands of the next enslaver. And that is a question that Africa's people and Africa's leaders must solve ourselves first. And so that is one of the reasons why we are in the difficulty. I have great disappointment. And if I see what is happening now, 3 African countries at this moment are in upheaval because the presidents of those countries have abused the situation of the virus to claim for themselves a 3rd term, which is unconstitutional in all 3. And that's a problem. What I find in the US with the Black Lives Matter, I find in the revolutionary youth of Africa who are now seeing all of this and who are not sitting idly by. So that is a question, is how can Africa reclaim itself for herself and for her children? And we must begin by being quite honest about the kind of leadership we are having at the moment and the kind and quality of leadership we need for the immediate future.
Thank you. We have another question from Louvain, and it's also focused on Africa. Is there precedence in history of splintered Black churches wherein many church leaders and their followers support a white supremacist political leader with millions of followers? And how can we have the conversation about this reality about the Black church, if indeed it exists? That's
Professor White.
That's to you, Dr. Bosak.
Oh, it's to me. Oh.
Yes.
I thought it was to Dr. White. But one of the difficulties, let me begin to say, in Africa, of course, Christianity came to us when we were invaded by white Christians. And so the presence of the Christian church was at first a colonializing, colonized, imperializing presence. Then African churches began to break away. And the more we study those breakaways, unlike what we first heard from mostly Western scholars, that the breakaways were because of cultural reasons. The whites won't allow us to play our drums in church, for instance. The whites wanted structured services, while for us, we wanted the Spirit to move free and give her the freedom to move with us and move us, and it didn't matter how long, and white people can't stand with it. White people must have 1 hour on Sunday for God, and then it's over. So they were thinking along those lines, but we are beginning to realize more and more and more that the first breakaways were decidedly political breakaways, because our people sensed that Christianity and the church was yet another form of control, a kind of internalizing into Christianity of the colonialist project. And that is what made the Ethiopian church, for instance, break away. And so we had that. It took, however, a long time for us to regain that independent spirit from the beginning. I'm always thinking, and I use it as a self-critical, self-reflective way of thinking about my own ministry, of what Steve Biko said way back in 1972. Steve Biko said, talking about white missionaries, that Christianity in Africa has become the most effective instrument for the subjugation of our people. But nowadays, he says, nowadays, talking to Black preachers, he says, it is the interpretation of the Bible by Black preachers that still makes Christianity the most effective instrument of the subjection of our people. Now, in that sense, because we have allowed our minds to become completely colonized, that was the battle we've been fighting for the last 50 years or so. And we've seen some success, but we've not been totally successful. And also, just as what Gaylord Wilmore used to call the rise of radical Black Christianity came into fruition in South Africa properly after the 1960s into the 70s and especially the 1980s. At that same time, towards the beginning of the 1990s, we have seen a flood of white imperialist, fundamentalist, new Pentecostalist Christianity flooding our country. And I think the same is true for Latin America. And so it is an imperialist religion, a recolonizing, not just of the church and of our minds, but of our Christian being and also of our societies. And that is what we are battling with right now. And so I find here Black Christian leaders in those churches who, the moment they serve under white leaders, the moment they try to assert leadership, they have to leave the church and start a Black church on their own. So they are beginning to understand what this means. But it is a very toxic, poisonous package of white imperialism that comes to us, and it includes a jihadism against everybody who is not a born-again, Bible-believing Christian. A military warfare almost against LGBTQI people, and especially against women. And so that is our battle at the moment. And that's why I raised the question in my presentation, is the Black church, can we once again be that prophetic, anti-imperialist, anti-colonialist church that we used to be, that we were at one point? Or have we become an enabler of the re-enslavement and the recolonization of our people? And that is the question I think the Black church in Africa, as well as the Black church in America, as probably the church in Latin America as well, if my colleague will agree with me, we have to fight and struggle with those issues, and very seriously so.
Okay, this question coming up was my question, and I want to move it both to Africa and Latin America and the Caribbean. So if you'll all, the practicalities of the Black church, the shrinking budget due to, or shrinking resources due to the disproportionate impact of the virus, both on the church and on the people of the church. Are the churches in South America and South Africa in particular experiencing similar developments? And is the impact of the virus also disproportionately impacting Black and colors? Whereas here we're finding with research here in the States that there's a disproportionate impact on the Black and people of color, Native Americans and so forth. Are those color patterns? And well, I'm asked two questions. One had to do with the economic impact on the Black church, and the other one had to do with colorism or racism. And are there any associations or interactivity between the two? Do you understand my question? Okay. Maybe we'll move to South America, and maybe if you want to chime in later. Dr. Caballas, has he left?
Yes. We cannot understand.
The term I meant was intersectionality. Sorry. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah. I think it is hard to. I don't think that the framework that we have here for race would be properly adapted to Brazil, because we don't have. Here you have the Black church, there you have the Christian church with all colors. There's no history of Black civil rights, and has never been like apartheid, or there hasn't been a sense of a fight against Jim Crow and so on and so forth, that kind of gives an identity to a people. So that's why it is much harder to work with race in Brazil, because it lips through the whole history, which is fundamentally there in every single cell of the history of Latin America. But it is hard to pin because you say, well, no, where is it? You always had, you know, after Princess Isabel, you have your freedom. And so it's much more difficult to pin that in regards to a people, because it's all of the Black people and all of the colored people and all of the whites, and they belong to so in Brazil you have to analyze a church by geography, not by race, and that gives us a different perspective into it. But what we can say is that all of the poor, which include, that's why I was playing with the notion of all blacks, all almost blacks, all browns, all whites who were blacks, and all almost blacks, and all blacks, fully blacks are there. And so they're all suffering. And the economics is exactly, there's no economics there, it's very little. So, and here's, then I think I'm going to respond to that by asking a question, perhaps to Dr. White, which is the way that the churches are surviving is indeed because of the Black women. The churches are surviving because the women are making a way out of no way. Even without a womanist theology there, they are doing it. There is womanist theology without none of the resources that we have here, right? And so how do we tell that that's why they are, I would say that the Black women are the target. They're killing all the Black men. Every day, 7 to 10 black men die in Brazil.
Wow.
Every day. Just not long ago, the army stopped this family. It was a Black family in the community, just a kind of a lower middle class family. And because there was Black people inside, they shot 256 shots to a Black family. They were going to a birthday party of their daughter. So it's always on target. It's always, right? And so it is, but it is the ways, because the Black boys are being killed, and boys literally, once they go into a higher into a certain age, they join either the drug movement, or if they don't, they are killed at the same time. And so it is the Black women who are holding it together. They are cooking, they are spreading, they are sharing the meager resources, they are feeding everyone. And that is not to say that they are strong, but on the other hand, without them, this whole people would disappear.
Okay. Can I just say something?
Yes, okay, we're coming to your question too. Okay, but go ahead.
Okay, it's actually a question and it follows
Yes.
off that. So how sustainable are the efforts of the weak and frail communities that are sustaining life and vitality in these modest Black churches? Because they don't have access to the vaccines, they don't have access to sophisticated treatment, little access to their basic human needs. So what can they do to, in the long term, meet the needs of their communities without people burning out and crashing, really, so that the communities and the members and the churches are sustained into the future?
My sister, I would say that they are burned out already. And there is a lot of mental health issues, anxiety going through the roof, people with panic attacks and depression and dread. And in Brazil, it's literal. If here is true, in Brazil, I would say it's 10 times more dangerous for you to just get out of, even if you stay home. Even if you stay home, it's dreadful just to stay home in those communities. So I would say that I think is stretching the very little that they have. It's keep on stretching because resources are not coming. And more of the worse, now if there were the drug dealers now are being swallowed by the militias. And here's the thing, the drug dealers were part of the community. They were the daughters and the sons and the grandsons of the mothers of the community. So there was an ethic that kept that community going. Now with the militia using the power of the law to kill them, to put them in jail, they are taking that space to take over. And now they are people from outside of the community. They couldn't care less. Now they are charging the people for living. So they have to pay a regular rent plus the rent to the militia. And so the resources are I don't know if we use the word migrating. It's lower and lower and lower. And that's why when I think about resistance, that troubles me in some ways, because it also is different from vulnerability. But the notion of resistance entails a scream of, I'm dying, I'm resisting, but that's my last breath in screaming, I am re-existing. And so that's why you have a huge number of people dying that we don't even have access to. I was searching numbers from those communities to bring to you. There's no way to find. I called people from those communities that are my friends, and I say, give me the numbers. What? And they said, we don't know. Every week we see some people die, every week. But they just amount to the ones killed by the police, to violence of all sorts. They're just adding up. I don't know how long. It is just by the grace of God, by the mercy of Olorumisha.
I'd like to follow up on that with a, I'd like to follow up on that with a question. I've been looking at these tracking interactive maps and showing lower counts in around Africa and lower counts in some of the Latin American than in Europe and in America. And I'm wondering if that's simply that there aren't as many test strips or facilities to really count or to keep track of what's going on. So I was wondering if you had any response to that, because it doesn't seem as though the statistics are accurate, particularly in Africa. I've been seeing that it seems as though they're saying that the virus is spreading at a lower pace there than it is in other areas. But I wonder, can we believe that?
Well,
anyone that wants to answer it.
Go ahead.
No, it's Dr. Bosak.
Yes.
Well, look, in many cases, of course, Africa does not have the resources from government, the health systems that other countries have, even though, even in our situation, every day I think of COVID, I thank God that we have Cyril Ramaphosa with all these difficulties and mistakes that I'm very critical of, rather than Donald Trump, because our response to the virus was much better and much more effective. Our problem, of course, is the moment we heard about this virus and the simple things they say, wash your hands, social distancing, that's okay for somebody like me. But in the squatter camps, where people live literally on top of one another, Dr. Cavares will know what I'm talking about, and where there is one tap for 100 families, and where the sewage is running through what they call streets, which is really just mud openings in the winter rains here in Cape Town. So what does it mean then to say wash your hands regularly? social distancing. What does that mean if you have a 6 by 10 foot room where 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 people must sleep? So those are the challenges that we have. But it is true that Africa's numbers are a lot better than we had feared. And I'm not taking that from our government only. You can check with the World Health Organization. South Africa was even mentioned as one of the countries that sort of sets a model for others, even though we were very critical of many of the things our government was trying to do. But here, the Western Cape, where I live, was one of the more seriously hit areas. And for the last month or so, we've been going down steadily. I was very pleased the other day, just across from me is a small shopping center. And they had a mobile testing center there for people. I went there twice in the week just to go and check. And I was gratified to see that the lines for people who wanted to be tested snaked right down across the whole parking lot into the street. So people are taking it more seriously or as seriously as they should. Here in Cape Town, in South Africa, if you go to a shopping to go some shopping in a supermarket, they will not let you into the door if you don't wear a mask. They will turn you back. If you go in there, there's a little register. You put your name down, they take your temperature, they write it down, you put your address, you put your telephone number so that if something happens, they can track you. So I'm very grateful for that kind of thing. And of course, here we don't have that nonsense that wearing a mask does something to my manhood or to my freedom or some such stuff. And that helps. And so, yes, we're not saying that we have gone through this thing. We don't know. We don't have in Brazil, we've just heard, question of militias and so forth, but we do have gangs who, of course, exploit the situation of the virus. It always struck me, almost from the very beginning, in the first month of the virus, the first spike that went up was not people getting the virus, but the first spike was in gender-based violence. And so the first thing that we saw when lockdown came and when we had to stay indoors and when there was a curfew, that the frustrations and the anger and whatnot of men were taken out upon vulnerable women and girl children. And so for us, that is one of the things that we have to give attention to and that we try to raise every single time we talk about these issues. But Africa is doing a bit better than the expectations had been. And it's not because of some mythical thing that your black skin protects you from I'm not talking about that nonsense. I'm really talking about what we can see and as far as we can judge that to be true.
Okay, here's a question that might be able to go out into all regions. It's from Tunde Abiole Kole. Okay, Dr. Kabaye's big picture view of COVID as a result of disharmony with nature, if I could put it that way, is quite interesting. It is also interesting that he connects this to white supremacy, colonialism, and the relations of power between strata of society across the world. However, I think these forces have been present in all political systems and not just capitalism. The role of the church is to help us reach beyond our differences and show social fractures, as Dr. Cavalle seemed to imply. But can the church reach beyond its own divisions to forge a unity that will enable it to have a larger impact locally and globally?
And can I add to that and ask, has there ever been a unified, homogeneous Black church?
No.
In Latin America, you mean?
Anywhere.
Anyway, yeah, no, I don't think so.
It doesn't exist.
Right, no.
Yeah,
no.
it's not a monolith.
I think it's just our constant hope to think them as monolithic, which is easier to think them in terms of monolithic systems. But no, not at all. They are as diverse as they can be. And I agree with my sister that is also political systems. They're all intertwined, right? In the I think the structure of colonizations is rooted on patriarchalism, in homophobia, in capitalism, and so all the political systems that we have is all embedded in those structures. So that's why, as much as I'm being grateful to God about Biden, the Democrats and the Republicans are all the same thing. Yes. And if we are ready to, I don't know. I think, see, sometimes I don't understand. I wish the gospel would make what Jesus said, to set you free, to set us free. But it keeps us encapsulated into our own systems of belief, that we keep looking at our tail, so afraid of losing our tail. And I think my Christianity is as strong as it makes me free to go away, not only from my own church bearings, but also to go beyond Christianity itself. Right? And that's the freedom that Jesus brings us, right? And I think that is the pounding on our head that we need to have. I mean, I don't think Christianity has a cosmology that can respond to the demands of nature now. That's why I brought an indigenous cosmology and I brought a Yoruba cosmology, because they can help us think, or at least ask the questions that we need to ponder. So my last paragraph that I didn't read was, so the Yanomami says, if we don't, the Shapiris, the spirit says, if we don't get close to the ways of the nature and the spirits and the way of living, the sky is going to fall on our heads. Olumu was saying to us, there's a demand that we change collectively or the healing will not come. The balance will not come. So what would be that very notion of cosmology that demands us to engage with nature? What kind of transformation and conversion that we need to go to in order to bring back the sources of nature? See, and this is one thing that I don't understand of most theology, because there's no earth, there's no land, there's no territory in most of our theologies. It's all about ideas. And that's why we need to think from the earth. We are all people, all of our Black people are people without land. It's been taken away from us. And now we think about ideas. And we think about, as much as we keep on thinking about identity without thinking about the earth, we are just floating on the sources of richness. Or we talk about our theology without saying, you wanted to bring back God into the discourse, talk about land, about restitution, about private property, about the ways in which we have turned everything into something that we own. We have to change that. We have to go after the land that has been stolen from our people. And that's, for me, it is through those issues that I think that we can find commonality, because most of our people are landless. And not through the ecumenism of what is the place of Jesus Christ in relation to the prophet or in relation to Buddha, which is great too, but I think we have other grounds that we can all stay within, that we can all share. And from that place, that denominator under which we all stand on is the place for us to join each other and then gain the power to transform things.
Here's another question I'll throw out, and I think it also applies outside of Africa. It's to Tunde again. While responding to Dr. Moye Okome's question, Can Dr. White, this is for her, also touch on the role of the Black church can play in the objective conditions of the Black people beyond the spiritual? It's directed to Dr. White. She's still there.
Yes, I'm reading the question. Thanks. Yeah, thank you. I'm reading the question in the chat. I want to make sure I'm following. Tunde, thank you for your question. Okay. Yeah, so yeah, the material beyond the spiritual. I think one of the things that that was implicit in my remarks is the way we have allowed a certain kind of power to be held by our symbols. And I very only implicitly suggested this, but my thought is that we have the symbol of this symbol of resilience that works itself out in very masculinist logics, where we think power means dominance. And then we think that our response, materialist response, must mean some notion of prosperity. And so the question to our materialist conditions is informed by our symbol systems and what we think, where we place our values. And we have placed value on a very masculinist, racist symbol system. And I'm concerned that the response to the materialist condition we have to call into question where we place our values before we can even begin the work of addressing the material. Because the material for us looks like a prosperity gospel. The material for us, oh, you said it so beautifully, Dr. Carvallis, in the merchandise, the indigenous perspective of everybody in the capitalist society, neoliberal thinking is merchandise, our notion of possession. So our notion of poverty actually is ironically over-spiritualized in our symbol system, and the way in which we have put so much emphasis on the causal link between divine favor as an expression of possession and possession of merchandise. Yeah. So, and this is so intimately linked to our relationship to the earth and to land and the dispossession of land and extraction from land. And also, I'm thinking of Michelle Wright. If you know Black feminist thought, you'll know Michelle Wright's what she calls the middle passage epistemology. And that, yeah, we may not have time to talk about that, but yeah, those are just some thoughts. I'm conscious of Dr. Bozak's need to leave for another appointment, so I feel we.
Okay, so Dr. Bozak, can I just ask the question? What you say about statistics, I think, can be said about South Africa and a handful of African countries. I come from Nigeria. The statistics gathering there is not really well done. And somebody else mentions here, there's a stigma attached to being infected by COVID. And so if people die from it, their family is not going to be upfront about telling people that's what killed them. Also, you know, there are many people who in Nigerian hospitals, they're taken to the hospital and the family knows they have COVID-like symptoms, but they're afraid that the hospital would not admit them. So they would not describe the symptoms. And then by the time it's found out, infection may have set off and affected other people, the people who are treating them. So I don't have as much confidence as you do, because there's an uptick in the number of deaths, but people are not saying it's COVID, you know. And then social distancing is possible in supermarkets, but not in markets, you know, in the indigenous type markets. And there's been an uprising in Nigeria, and people going to get food from places where they're stockpiled. People are not practicing safe distancing. They can't. It's not just in the crowded habitation of people where they don't have the proper sanitation because of years of neglect and nonchalance by the state. It's also that in the material conditions of people, whether it's in their everyday life or it's in you know, just tragic situations and uprisings, you know, people, it's just, you know, ripe areas for infection. So I know the discourses of, oh, Africa is not being affected. I don't have any trust in the statistics, and I wonder what you think beyond South Africa.
I mean, it's difficult to say. I can speak mostly confidently about the situation in South Africa. I wouldn't dare to say anything about other African countries apart from what one sees on television and what is being reported and what one hears from the World Health Organization. One of the things, so I agree with you. I'm not trying to say that all of Africa is doing just greater than the rest of the world because we have dealt with it much better. I'm not trying to say that. What I'm trying to say is that certainly here, we have been very much alert from the very beginning. One of the things that the government has done here, and I don't know what they did in Nigeria, is to put together in those very, very first week, a team of experts, medical experts, apart from the political team set aside by the government from politicians of the different departments to work together to try and see what we can do. And one of the things that came out is that when we were hit so hard, you remember, in the late 1980s, but especially in the 1990s, by HIV and AIDS, that was when we knew that a number of people were dying and that we didn't know why, because of the stigma. So a lot of the education here in the very beginning has gone into this question. Please don't think that this is a stigma. The COVID is a virus that can attack anybody. And so that process of education on television, on radio, in as many ways as one possibly could, that has helped. And of course, the experience that the South African medical world has undergone and has gained through the fight with HIV and AIDS is now coming to help us. So I don't think that with COVID, the stigma is as much of a problem as it was with HIV and AIDS. And I think that is helpful. Again, I can't say how that is treated in Nigeria. We don't have, for instance, here in Cape Town, we don't have those open markets like I know that we have in some other African countries where there is just no social distancing and so forth. Here, the government has not succeeded in doing what could have been a better job, I still think. Well, I mean, for one thing, if you set aside 30 billion rand to help small businesses, or you set aside so many billion rand for people to put together with, and you raise the pensions and you raise the aid that the state gives, and half of that gets stolen, that is a problem. And so my fight with the government is Cyril Ramaphosa has said, oh, we are setting up a special task force to deal with that, and we're checking that out. But that's been weeks ago. We still haven't heard what has become of that. We need to see people being held accountable so that that stops. And that's one of the problems that Cyril Ramaphosa does have, is he makes these statements and he has these amazing intentions, but somehow he battles to give body and reality and political weight to those intentions so that they become a part of what the people see the government is trying to do to help us fight the situation. But so I'm not trying to speak for the rest of Africa. All I can say is what one gathers. Here, we have not just government and governmental bodies, but we have a number of NGOs that are monitoring as closely as they can what is happening in this situation here. And all one can do is you can do the best you can. And my difficulty with the church, but that's for another conversation down the line, is that I think the churches were actually slower to catch on with what the government was trying to do. We did have churches who said, we will abide by all the rules, because there was a time when we could have no more than 10 people and then no more than 50 people. Now it's 250 people that can gather for a church house. The government still talks almost weekly about not having great gatherings. Don't all go to funerals. I went to a funeral because I had to. And when I got to the gate, they took my name and took my ID number. And they had a list where when we came to 100 in those days, early in the lockdown, they closed the gates. Nobody could come in. So that we had, but we did have some of these pastors who were saying, yeah, but God will protect us, and God is greater than the government, and we must not be stopped worshiping God, and so forth. We had that. But then we had people in the communities who actually called the police, and the police came and closed down those church services. And so it's that kind of thing that I'm looking at. And all I can say is I'm hoping that over all of Africa, we'll begin to realize what this means, and that we will work hand in hand, the government, the communities, the churches, and all of these agencies, to make sure that our people are safe and that we get through this thing as unscathed as possible.
Well, folks, I have been told by my boss that we have to cut it off. When I mean my boss is the chair of our organization, Yemi Abioye, because we don't have any more time. But what I have done is I have copied all of the questions and everything that we have in the chat, and I saved them, and I'm going to put those on our Facebook page, which is the African Fellowship Facebook page. And we will then also have all of your names so that we can send you invitations to join it if you have not joined the African Fellowship page. And we can I'll figure out between me and Yemi and everyone else how we can set up a chat there so that we could interact on these questions. So that's what I will do. And we will be in touch with you about future events such as what we have. And there are also some people who answered questions about people asked about different resources, and they have in the chat, so we'll be publishing this online, in the chat, people directed people to where they can get those resources. Wow, we had a wonderful discussion, but we have run out of time. But hopefully we can follow up and engage in these kinds of discussions in the future and have more educational series like this. So you will be hearing from me. May I turn this back to Yemi?
Yeah, thank you, Colleen, and everyone, and thank you to the panelists. Colleen, you did a wonderful job. And Colleen is my colleague, not boss. To close us out, can Joe, can you please give us a closing prayer before we go?
Is Joseph Dugan still there?
I am.
Okay.
You hear me?
Yep.
Gracious God, our hearts are filled with your glory this day. We ask you to bless us, inspire us, not to celebrate for too long because we have so much work to do. We have to release the 545 children from the cages that they're in.
Man.
We have to protect Black and brown bodies who our state and our nation funds executions that happen on our streets every day.
Man.
We have to gather our energy to move our country and world to a glorious multiplicity where all people may flourish and cease to die in premature ways. Now send us on your way. Gather us in the unity of your glory so that we may live with you in the kingdom here on earth. We bless all those who have spoken this day. Bless them in their work. Give them continued courage. Do not let them despair. And then we will celebrate in your life, in your time, in your glory. Amen.
Amen.
Well, we're going to pull this to a close. Like I said, I took down everyone's name from the chat, and you will hear from us in the future. We're going to continue this, and so thank you for coming. And I guess that's about it.
Have a wonderful Sunday, everyone, and a wonderful week.
God
Yes,
bless you.
thank you.
Thank you.